Have you ever spoken someone's name and felt a sudden eerie shift in the air, as if they somehow knew you were talking about them? What if saying their name could actually summon them no matter where they were? This isn't just some urban legend. It's a real story about a boy named Daniel, a classmate so strange and unsettling that even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened. What I discovered about him on one stormy night has left me terrified to ever speak his name again. When I was in high school, there was a kid who stood out for all the wrong reasons. Let's call him Daniel, though his actual name sounded like it belonged in some ancient horror tale, and I refused to even write it. Daniel wasn't just awkward, he was deeply unsettling. He wore the same filthy, threadbare hoodie every day, rain or shine, and the stench of it was so bad that people avoided sitting near him. His hood was always pulled up, and he never took off his sunglasses, even indoors. Eventually, even the teachers stopped asking him to remove them. Daniel didn't have friends in the traditional sense. Instead, he had this unnerving habit of adopting people. If he liked you, which seemed completely arbitrary, he would approach you, look you in the eye and say, "You're adopted." It wasn't a joke. In his mind, it meant you were safe from him. Safe from what exactly? No one knew, but he always acted as if it was some kind of privilege. For reasons I never fully understood, Daniel adopted me early on. Maybe it was because he had a crush on me. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Just another weird thing he did. But looking back, I wonder if being adopted was the only thing that kept me out of harm's way. The first truly strange incident happened one sunny afternoon. My friends and I, Anna, Jake, Sophie and I, were hanging out near the bleachers behind the school. We were laughing and gossiping, and somehow the conversation turned to Daniel. I don't remember who started it, but Sophie accidentally said his real name out loud. Not once, but 3 times. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but the moment she said it for the 3rd time, Daniel appeared. I don't mean we saw him walking toward us. 1 second we were alone. The next, he was there, perched on top of the bleachers like some kind of predator, holding a baseball bat. His hood was up, his sunglasses hiding his eyes, and he just stared at us. None of us moved. We didn't know if he had heard us or if he planned to do something. After a long, excruciating silence, he nodded at me. Just me, before climbing down and walking away without a word. My friends laughed nervously after he was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed some invisible line. The next incident happened a few weeks later at Anna's house. We were upstairs in her bedroom, chatting about school and people we didn't like. At some point, Daniel came up in conversation and, stupidly, we said his name 3 times again. We didn't think anything of it until we heard the front door slam downstairs. We rushed down, thinking it might be one of Anna's friends. Instead, we found Daniel standing in her living room, casually talking to her mum. When Anna's mum asked him why he was there, he replied, "I was summoned." Summoned. The word sent chills down my spine. Anna's mum, who knew Daniel vaguely, was polite but firm, and she eventually managed to get him to leave. Anna and I were shaken, though. How could he have known we said his name? Was he eavesdropping? Or was it something worse? That night we made a pact. Never again would we say Daniel's name 3 times. Once, maybe twice, but never 3. It seemed silly, but after that day, none of us were willing to take any chances. Months later, I found myself home alone during a thunderstorm. My parents rarely went out, so I decided to invite a guy I liked over. We were hanging out in my room, laughing about random things, when I made the mistake of telling him about Daniel. He didn't believe me. In fact, he found it hilarious. Before I could stop him, he grinned and shouted Daniel's name 3 times, louder each time. The room fell silent. Then, almost immediately, the storm outside intensified. Lightning flashed so close to the house that the windows rattled, and the rain began to pour in torrents. I ran to the window to close it, but when I looked outside, I froze. Daniel was there, standing in the driveway, drenched but completely still, staring up at my window. His hood was pulled tight, and the rain dripped from the edges. My heart was pounding as I pulled the blinds shut and locked every door in the house, but it didn't stop. A few minutes later, I saw him again, this time standing in the front yard, closer than before. I panicked yelling, "I'm adopted! I'm adopted!" over and over, hoping it would keep him at bay. The guy I was with tried to calm me down, but I could tell he was scared too. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside again, Daniel was gone. The next morning, after an almost sleepless night, I finally mustered the courage to step outside and inspect the yard. The rain had left the ground damp and muddy, and everything felt eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. As I walked around, my eyes caught something unusual in the far corner, partially concealed by the thick bushes near the fence. It was his hoodie, dirty, soaked through and smeared with mud. I hesitated before picking it up, a strange sense of dread creeping over me as my fingers brushed the damp fabric. Curiosity overcame fear and I checked the pockets. What I found inside sent chills down my spine. There were several small items, things I hadn't even noticed were missing. An old bracelet I thought I'd lost years ago, my school ID, and most unsettling of all, a small photo of me. The edges were frayed as if it had been handled repeatedly, the image slightly smudged from water damage. I stood there frozen, trying to piece together how he could have possibly gotten his hands on these things. Had he been in my house? Was he watching me closer than I'd ever imagined? The implications were too much to process. My first instinct was to call the police, but I stopped myself. What would I even say? I felt paralyzed, as though speaking about it out loud might somehow make it worse. After that day, Daniel vanished. He stopped coming to school entirely, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. His absence felt surreal. At first, I was overwhelmed with relief. Finally, I could breathe again, go through my day without the shadow of his presence looming over me. But relief gave way to a gnawing unease. Where had he gone? What was he doing? And why did he leave so abruptly? Deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just disappeared. He was waiting. The years passed, and life moved on. But the memory of those days stayed with me, lingering like a scar I couldn't fully erase. My parents eventually decided to renovate the house, turning the backyard into a landscaped garden. During the construction, one of the workers called my dad over to show him something unusual they'd unearthed. It was a small, rusted tin box, buried just a few feet beneath the soil. My dad handed it to me, assuming it might be some forgotten childhood treasure of mine. When I opened it, my heart stopped. Inside the box were dozens of scraps of paper, each one yellowed with age and scribbled in the same jagged handwriting. They all bore the same chilling message. "I'm watching you." Over and over again, the phrase repeated, written with varying levels of pressure, as though the person had spent hours, maybe days, obsessively scrawling the same words. The realization hit me like a cold wave. He hadn't disappeared. At least, not in the way I'd hoped. He'd been here, around the house, long enough to bury this box. The thought of him lurking, hiding just out of sight, sent a shiver through my entire body. Even though years had passed, the feeling of being watched suddenly returned, sharper and more suffocating than before. To this day, I wonder what happened to Daniel. Did he move on to someone else? Or is he still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to reappear? Some nights, I wake up and feel the urge to check the windows just to be sure. The backyard may have changed, but the memory of that tin box reminds me that some things never truly leave. They only hide, waiting to be found again. Have you ever stopped to help someone in need, only to later wonder if you made the right choice? What if that act of kindness turned out to be a trap? Tonight, we delve into a chilling tale that starts on a snowy evening and ends with a horrifying twist. Stick around, because the answer to this mystery will leave you questioning everything. A few winters ago, in the city of Fairview, my best friend Sam and I were heading to a dinner party on a frigid Saturday night. The streets were cloaked in snow, and an icy wind howled through the dark suburban neighborhood. On the way, we decided to make a quick stop at a liquor store to grab something for the hosts. I wasn't thrilled about the detour given the worsening weather, but showing up empty-handed wasn't an option. Inside the store, we picked out a few bottles of locally brewed beer and a nice whiskey. As we left, the snowfall became heavier, turning the roads into slick, treacherous paths. Sam ran back into the store for some nicotine pouches, leaving me waiting in the car and silently cursing the timing. Finally, he returned, and we resumed our journey. The snowstorm intensified, making visibility a challenge. Despite the dangerous conditions, the drive should have been straightforward, a 20-minute trip through familiar streets. But something about that night felt off, even before the real trouble began. As we navigated the icy roads, our route took us up a steep hill. Turning a sharp corner, we came upon an eerie sight. A lone car in the middle of the road with its hazard lights flashing. Both the driver and passenger doors were wide open, and the vehicle stood there like an abandoned relic in the storm. "Just drive around it," I muttered. But Sam shook his head. "What if someone's in trouble?" he argued. I hesitated. Sam was always the curious type, but this felt different. I wasn't the kind of person who jumped at the chance to help strangers, especially in such odd circumstances. Against my better judgment, I stopped the car. The two of us sat in silence for a moment, staring at the flickering hazards. The orange lights reflected off the falling snow, casting an almost hypnotic glow. Then Sam spoke. "We should check it out." "Heck." "I'm checking it out," I shot back, refusing to leave the warmth of the car. Sam rolled his eyes. "Watching from here won't do anything," he said, opening the door before I could stop him. As Sam began to approach the eerily abandoned car, a sinking, almost primal dread spread through my chest, like ice seeping into my bones. The scene before me, the flashing hazards, the open doors, the relentless snowfall blanketing the surroundings, felt like something out of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I kept my eyes fixed on Sam's figure, silhouetted against the swirling white flakes. The storm seemed to devour him, making him look smaller, more vulnerable, with each step. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles whitening, as if the act of holding on could somehow tether him and me to safety. A strange sensation prickled at the edge of my awareness, like the kind of unease you feel when someone is watching you. My gaze darted around nervously, scanning the darkened street and the skeletal outlines of snow-covered trees. Nothing. Just the quiet hum of the hazards and the muffled roar of the storm. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught it. A fleeting motion. A dark blur shifting against the pale backdrop. It was so quick, so faint, that I questioned if I'd seen anything at all. A shadow? A gust of wind stirring the snow? Or something more sinister lurking just out of sight? My pulse quickened as my imagination ran wild, conjuring images of hidden figures, crouched and waiting. I leaned forward instinctively, trying to get a better view. The world outside the car felt suffocatingly silent, save for the relentless patter of snow against the windshield. My breath fogged up the glass as I strained to focus. Then it happened again. The parked car jolted, just a tiny, almost imperceptible shift, as though something inside had moved. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Enough to make my heart lurch and my stomach churn. My mind screamed at me to act, to do something, anything, before it was too late. "Sam, get back here!" I shouted, my voice cracking with a mix of fear and urgency. The words felt raw, torn from my throat, and hung in the icy air like a desperate plea. Sam paused mid-step, turning back toward me with a puzzled expression, his breath clouding around his face. "What?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. I didn't answer. My instincts took over. Without thinking, I slammed my hand down on the horn. The sharp, jarring blare ripped through the stillness like an alarm, its echo bouncing off the snow-covered houses and trees. Sam flinched visibly, startled, his head snapping toward the abandoned car. For a brief, harrowing moment, time seemed to stand still. The world was suspended in that single note of sound. My eyes darted between Sam and the ominous vehicle, half expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. Sam got the message. He spun around and bolted toward the car, his boots slipping slightly on the icy road as he ran. His breath came out in rapid puffs, visible even from where I sat, and I could feel my own heartbeat pounding in sync with his footsteps. "What's wrong with you?" he demanded breathlessly, as he yanked open the car door and climbed inside. The frustration in his tone was clear, but I barely registered it. "I think it's a trap," I whispered, my voice barely more than a rasp. My hands clung to the steering wheel like a lifeline, trembling with the adrenaline coursing through me. Sam stared at me, his brows furrowed in disbelief. but I didn't give him a chance to argue. My foot hit the gas pedal, and the tires screeched briefly before finding traction on the snowy road. The car surged forward, leaving the flashing hazards, and whatever nightmare they concealed, behind us. As we sped away, I couldn't bring myself to look back. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had someone been hiding in the car, waiting to pounce? Were we moments away from being ambushed? The unanswered questions clawed at me, but one thing was certain. I wasn't about to stick around to find out. The drive to the party was tense. Sam accused me of overreacting, and I defended my instincts. Better paranoid than dead, I retorted. The argument fizzled out as we reached our destination, a warm house glowing with laughter and music. For a while, we managed to forget the unsettling encounter. The night carried on with good food, old friends, and plenty of drinks. Hours later, as the snowstorm began to ease, our host turned on the TV to check the weather. That's when the atmosphere shifted. The local news was broadcasting a chilling story, a warning about a carjacking in the area. The reporter described how a mother and her teenage son had stopped to help what appeared to be an abandoned car with flashing hazards. As they approached, two men emerged from behind a nearby snowbank, and another leapt out from the vehicle's trunk. Armed and aggressive, they forced the woman to hand over her keys before fleeing in both cars. The reporter added that the suspects were still at large. Sam and I exchanged horrified glances. "That could have been us," he whispered. The room fell silent as we recounted our own experience to the other guests, who listened in wide-eyed disbelief. Driving home later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The snowy streets, usually serene, felt darker, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound amplified. The faint hum of the car's engine was the only thing breaking the stillness, but even that felt intrusive. As we neared the spot where we'd seen the abandoned car earlier, my grip tightened on the steering wheel, an unease settling over me. I slowed down, almost without realizing it, half expecting to see the car again, as if it had been waiting for us to return. And there it was. The same car, its hazard lights flashing weakly in the empty street, casting an eerie orange glow on the snow. But this time, something had changed, something subtle but unmistakable. My breath caught as I noticed the ground around the vehicle. The pristine snow was now disturbed, marked by two sets of footprints leading away from the car and into the darkness beyond. One set was small, delicate, likely a woman's. The other was even smaller, unmistakably those of a child. Yet there was more, a trail of drag marks cutting through the snow as though something heavy had been pulled alongside the tracks. The sight sent a chill racing down my spine, colder than the winter air outside. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My pulse quickened, the unease morphing into dread. Sam's voice broke the suffocating silence, low and firm. "Just keep driving." His tone left no room for discussion, a plea wrapped in quiet urgency. I didn't argue. My foot pressed down on the accelerator, and we left the scene behind, the blinking lights fading into the rearview mirror. But the image of those footprints and drag marks followed us forever, even now, etched into my mind like a warning I will never be able to escape. Have you ever wondered if the people closest to you might be hiding something truly sinister? What if someone you trusted completely was secretly manipulating you for their own dark purposes? This is a story about how I uncovered a horrifying truth and the unexpected macabre twist that followed. The events I'm about to recount took place more than 3 decades ago, during a summer that started like any other, but ended with something I'll never forget. I was just 10 years old at the time, and my family was enormous. With so many relatives, it was hard for me to keep track of all the faces at our frequent gatherings. My father was one of 8 siblings, and we often spent summers at my grandparents' sprawling beach house, large enough to host over 30 people at once. The beach house was my sanctuary. I had cousins I considered closer than my school friends and aunts and uncles who always made me feel welcome. Among them, my favorite was Uncle Robert. He was charismatic, funny, and seemed to have an uncanny ability to make anyone feel understood. He was a therapist, and even at my young age, I trusted him implicitly. That summer, I began having nightmares. They weren't your typical bad dreams. They were vivid, horrifying, and emotionally draining. Sometimes I dreamed of losing my family, other times of being entirely alone forever. One particular dream still haunts me. I woke up in the dream, only to find my house eerily empty. No parents, no siblings, just an unbearable silence. After a few nights of this, I confided in Uncle Robert. He listened attentively, jotting down notes in his ever-present leather notebook. He told me my subconscious was trying to communicate something buried deep within me. "Reflect on your feelings," he said. But what kind of reflection could a 10-year-old do? When the nightmares worsened, I went back to him. This time, he suggested I might harbor hidden frustrations toward my parents, frustrations my dreams were amplifying. I was baffled.
I loved my parents and couldn't think of a single grievance. Uncle Robert encouraged me to test his theory by acting out slightly, being more defiant toward my parents.
Desperate for relief, I tried it. The result was heartbreaking. My parents were visibly hurt by my sudden disobedience, and it didn't help that the nightmares intensified. When I returned to Uncle Robert, he hesitated before revealing his final suggestion. My mind was too advanced for my body, and I needed to set it free. His words were cryptic, and when I pressed for clarity, he promised to explain after one more nightmare. That night, I went to bed with dread, but something unusual happened. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, not from a nightmare, but from an unsettling sound. For a moment I froze, unsure if I was awake or still dreaming. Then I heard a whisper directly in my ear. It was Uncle Robert's voice. Terrified, I turned and screamed. In the dim light, I saw him retreating from my room, shutting the door behind him. My heart raced as I bolted to my parents' room and told them everything. My dreams, Uncle Robert's advice, and the horrifying encounter that night. My father didn't hesitate. He confronted Uncle Robert, storming into his room and demanding answers. A heated argument ensued, during which my father grabbed Uncle Robert's leather satchel. Inside, he found something chilling. Detailed notes about my dreams, articles on inducing nightmares, and what appeared to be logs of experiments he'd conducted. On me. Uncle Robert fled the house that night, but the police later uncovered even darker truths on his computer. It turned out he had a history of using his position to manipulate vulnerable individuals for his twisted experiments. I never saw him again, and my family refused to discuss what happened to him afterward. Years later, I learned one last piece of information that has haunted me ever since. A cousin of mine, who'd also confided in Uncle Robert, shared a nightmare he'd had shortly before Uncle Robert vanished. In the dream, Uncle Robert whispered to him, "You're next." Have you ever experienced a nightmare so vivid it felt real, or uncovered a chilling truth about someone you trusted? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to know if anything like this has ever happened to you or someone you know. Don't forget to subscribe for more unsettling stories that will keep you up at night.